Although a lot of people don't believe me when I tell them that I'm originally from Texas and Oklahoma. I was born in Oklahoma. My family's from Oklahoma. I grew up in Dallas, Texas. I moved back to go to school there. After I graduated with my bachelor's degree in meteorology, I worked at a Weather News, which is right by campus, for about 4.5 years. I was one of the forecasters, the marine forecasters there. Moved up, traveled to Japan quite a bit as well too, because for some reason when I was working there, no one wanted to travel internationally to help train people that were in Japan. So very early on in my career, I was able to travel internationally, which I know a lot of people, you guys want to do, but just word to the wise, it is very exhausting. It's very exhausting. I apologize in advance. I actually have my 2.5-year-old daughter too. So just like bear with me as I try to get that. Just hold on. Okay, later, okay? Okay. So, so getting back to that, so I worked there for about 4.5 years. While I was working in routing ships around the world, forecasting the weather for them, there was another crisis that was going on, kind of the financial crisis, which locked things down for a long time across the board. In fact, I didn't get my job at Weather News until 8 months after graduating. I did a lot of temp work. I launched radio son balloons in Chickasha, Oklahoma. So I drove an hour and a half there and an hour and a half back to make $12 an hour doing that for 2 months. And then I moved down to Dallas and worked as a weather observer. But first, I worked for about 1 to 2 months without getting paid so I could get certified to be a weather observer while I was doing that. So then I worked as a weather observer at Dallas Love Field Airport for a number of months, like I said, before landing my first full-time job as a meteorologist. And like I said, that was shortly after the financial crisis. And so it was very common at that time for me and my peers to have done other things that were outside of meteorology altogether before we even landed in careers in meteorology. I knew some people who had their master's degrees that were working at a Foot Locker, that were working as managers of other places and such. And then after the financial crisis lifted and things like that, they would come to there. So, even though it's not directly the same as the crisis that's going on right now, because of course we didn't have to worry about people's health at the same time in a different way, but still, like I've seen the before, during, and after crises like this. They're not easy to get through, but somehow things rebound on the other side. It's just that there's death that's attached to this one, and it makes it that much greater. And there's some more gravitas that's attached to it. But I got really involved. I got really interested in fuel optimization because I was working for a private weather company. We were routing ships back and forth, and at first, when I started there, captain, crew, cargo, they wanted to do everything within their power to avoid any damage, any harm or anything like that. But with the financial crisis, fuel prices shot through the roof, and so shipping companies were just concerned on how to get what I need from point A to point B in the quickest amount of time. Let's take on as much weather as we possibly can and such like that. Let's try to divert as little as we can. So I got really interested in fuel optimization. That led me to my studies in weather derivatives as well too, and then got me interested in investment banking and what I could be doing on there. There were lots of weather derivatives desks that were at investment banks at the time. I didn't have a degree in finance. I didn't know anything about finance. I was one of those people that was like, I don't need to know anything else but about meteorology while I was in school. Completely naive, completely stupid. I just, was involved in my own little world and like what I could do with that. And then I thought, oh, let me go to business school. So I was in a program that got me around different people out at UCLA that were all prepping for business school. From there, I heard about job opportunities at Goldman Sachs in London. They were recruiting people from diverse backgrounds to go work out in London. That's how bad their diversity problem is out there. They were recruiting people from the United States to go work at a mid-career level out there. I got to final round interviews for a job at Goldman Sachs, and then they told me I didn't know what I was talking about, and they were right. I had no idea what I was talking about whatsoever, and so they did not give me the job. But they did offer me a job in human resources because I've been moonlighting as a career development advisor, helping my peers, helping my fellow students with cover letters, resumes, pitches, whys, interviewing prep, everything that you can possibly think of. I've been involved in that for a very, very long time. And so 3 months and 12 interviews later, I moved out to London and worked for Goldman Sachs for 2 years and their diversity and recruitment and career development. And I didn't like it at all. I am not cut out for corporate America, as it turns out. I'm much too eclectic to what it was at the time, though things have very, very much changed. And I liked working with students one-on-one. So I left Goldman Sachs. I came back to the United States. I worked at a nonprofit called Sponsors for Educational Opportunity, and there I worked with diverse students, students of color from all around the United States, helping to place them at the same investment banks that I didn't like working at in Fortune 500 companies and corporations, and mentoring them and provide coaching for them throughout the time I recruited them from their schools to the time that I placed them in their internships over the summer, and then throughout their internships so they could get full-time job opportunities or return opportunities for their subsequent summers. And then I got accepted to the business school program at Columbia University while I was working in New York City. And then I saw a flyer for the Climate and Society program, and I decided to do that instead. The best decision I ever did, because I had 7 years of work experience. I didn't know what it was like to work though and go to grad school solely. And so before I even started grad school, I was pitching myself to research scientists at a research institute that was attached to Columbia University called the International Research Institute for Climate and Society. And just so happened their climate scientists had, a dual climate scientist and entomologist had come down. She was wandering in the lobby wanting pizza. She asked me if I had ever read the autobiography of Malcolm X. And I asked her, she asked me that because I was the only Black person that was there. And she said, absolutely. That's exactly why I asked you this question. She was like, because I don't see anyone that I think that has read it and such. And from there, I started working for a woman called Madeline Thompson, who read the Climate and Health program. And that's where I started my career in climate and health, was editing papers. Just simply trying to do what I could to learn as much about the field that I could. That led to my research work that had to do with climate change and variability and ENSO teleconnections in East Africa. From there, I started working with public health institutes in East Africa, started traveling very frequently there as well too, and it blossomed into a career that had to do with working with the World Health Organization, teaching people how to integrate climate services, which I'll talk about a little later, into public health policies and plans. And then it also took me to East Africa, like I said, for 5 years. I traveled out there working with meteorological organizations from all in the Horn of Africa. And so because I had this meteorology background and I had the climatology background, I could speak to meteorologists and then digest information and related and training manuals. And so that is primarily what I did for the next 5 years. New York City became increasingly expensive. I also had a daughter, and I moved back down to Texas after being away for 17 years. And currently I'm in Dallas, Texas. I have been for the last year and a half. I went back to the same nonprofit in which I've used to work out before, so I still work at SEO. I'm a career development advisor there. I'm also an adjunct professor at Columbia University, teaching for the Climate and Society program, in which I graduated from too. I teach courses that have to do with how climate integrates with society, and then I support capstone projects and internships that students have and provide career development services for them as well. And I do some consultancy work for the World Health Organization as well too. So that's a lot. I know it is. I know I don't look that old. I promise I am. I'm not lying about my age. But I do have a very robust career that involves nearly every piece of what you can think of under the gamut of meteorology and climatology and other things, and how I've pivoted my career as well too, and have never been afraid to do it, because I do believe that you need to be well equipped with different skill sets, and all of the skills in which you have are applicable. It's just how you pitch yourself and how you go about doing those. So I thank Amanda for inviting me here today. She said that she wanted for me to talk a little bit about diversity in STEM and meteorology, and then talk about the importance of weather and climate data, because that is where my specialty lies. For sure. I am not a diversity, equity, and inclusion expert. I tell everybody just because I am Black does not mean that I'm an expert in this, field. But I do have a lot of experiences that relate to it as well too. So I'll try to do my best and relaying some of the things in which I know, some of the things I think that are important. I definitely welcome your questions afterwards about it too. This is a learning experience for all of us. Given that, Black Lives Matter, but not just that, but DEI in general is just something that's at the forefront because it has to do with humanity as a whole, and it has to do with justice. And those are things that are at the very forefront of any science and society. So it is very, very important. And I appreciate the space to talk about these things and to learn from you all as well too. So I'll start off. I'm kind of a person who does like lots of pictures for slides and not a lot of words. And so I just have this one slide about DEI, and it's going to talk about a lot of things in between here. And I'll stop and pause and see if there's anything that was. But when I think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, like previously when I would hear about these terms, I would only think about how I would fit into there, right? And it was very linearly. I'm a Black individual, I'm female, I did not grow up in a Christian household, so it's all the things that I could think about to check a box, right? And in truth, and in most situations, I serve really as a number in evaluating the success of an organization or a program's D&I efforts, their goals, and their initiatives. But now I don't find myself thinking about how I check a box because I'm thinking more strategically, and I'm thinking about how I can learn and educate myself on my experiences, my voice, and my tools to further to further enhance this change, right? Diversity as I know it, right, is the presence of differences within a given setting. So that means the workplace, there can be differences in race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, age, socioeconomic class, now like political affiliation and religion as well too. And it's interesting because when they, show their numbers and they're saying, look, we're really diverse, I always think to myself, that's not diverse, because true diversity is an equal amount of everything with overlaps, like a Venn diagram, right? So there's just an equal amount of everything like that's within there. So it's not really diversity at all that people are trying to strive for that. But no, really, workplaces here in the United States are diverse based on, the history of our country. And I acknowledge and I respect that this is one way to define diversity, right? It's a concept that can encompass many different other human differences as well. But this is a broad definition that we have because this is the 21st century. And then secondly, our definition encompasses, like I said, populations that historically have been and remain underrepresented, right? And marginalized in a broader society, right? And then when I think about equity, I think about equity as the act of ensuring that processes and programs are impartial, they're fair, and they provide equal process outcomes for every individual. So it takes into account the fact that not everybody is starting at the same level. And I have to be honest, it's a pet peeve when people are like, well, everybody has the ability to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. Negative, that's not the case, right? And it's not real. To think that everyone is starting at the same position and to discount that the United States has been involved in murdering people and slavery since the 1400s is just false, and thinking that just 100 years and because we had a Black president makes it so that people are all on the same playing field is absolutely false. I'm only talking about the experiences that have to do with my community. I'm not trying to discount the fact that there have been other people, especially females too, that have been very, very much oppressed as well, right? And then when I think about inclusion, I'm talking about the practice of ensuring that people feel a sense of belonging in the workplace, right, or anywhere, right? This means that everybody feels comfortable and they're supported in the organization. I shouldn't have to worry about, if you guys know about the term code switching, I shouldn't have to worry about code switching when I go into a place. That means that I may talk a different way amongst my family and amongst my community. Everyone does that, right? Everyone has a cadence to the way in which they talk. They drop the formalities when you're with the people in which you know the best and such. However, because we are in a predominantly white society, everything that is white, all the ways in talk are considered to be normal. All the ways in which I talk are not considered to be normal. So when I go into a certain organization and when I go into a certain setting, right, I shouldn't have to worry about switching back and forth based on who I'm talking to, because that should be normalized, right? Because that's part of who I am. So I shouldn't have to worry that I have to lead or shield a part of my identity because it's going to make someone else feel uncomfortable or such like that. And really, you know, really inclusion is what maintains diversity. And without it, people will come into an organization or a school, they'll look around and they'll say, well, you don't really uphold diversity because I don't see anybody that looks like me, right? You say that this place is diverse and you say that you're striving in these efforts, but it doesn't really look like you're doing anything. So really, like, we don't want to come in, anyone that's marginalized, they don't want to know that they're going to have to be the token person and represent a whole demographic, right? They shouldn't have to worry about that they're going to, what impact that they're going to, not negative impact, right? But all of these nouns, they remain as nouns unless there's measurable and progressive action that actually make them verbs. So diversifying, make equitable, and including someone as well too. Right. And so really, if we want to think about, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to go to the next slide. So I say that to say, going back to diversity in STEM and why it matters, I just wanted to kind of like set the forefront for what I'm talking about when I talk about diversity in STEM and why it matters, right? Because innovations that result from science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, have positively touched every aspect of our human life. And scientific innovations don't rise on their own. They're brought forth with the hard work and the ingenuity of scientists and of everyone that's involved, right? Therefore, the quality of our scientific research enterprise and its ability to meet the needs and positively impact the lives of individuals and communities and nations is inextricably linked to individuals or STEMists that are involved, right? And I can say this, I don't think that anybody, really disagrees with that. It's just how they go about implementing it and power dynamics that have to do with that, right? So I found that most of the disagreement in the conversation in which I have with other people, primarily older people, not to be ageist or anything, it's just a different way of thinking, right? And when I shift to diversity in science, that's where these disagreements come on, because when we talk about diversity in science, they're much, while these conversations are approached with much enthusiasm, others use scientific work, right, diversity efforts as unethical to ideas of meritocracy, right? The notion that one rises and falls solely on their ability and that the cream of sciences will eventually rise to the top, right? I've also engaged with colleagues who have never really explicitly thought about what diversity means, or they've avoided the topic altogether because of the controversy in which it can engender, right? Recognizing that many people in this conversation have really different perspectives, thinking that if we disagree, we're just not supposed to have this conversation, right? So again, what is diversity, right? It's used in many contexts, like I said, and often and unfortunately, diversity is used as the antonym of a heterosexual, able-bodied, middle-class, wealthy white male, right? That's what a lot of people think about when they think about diversity, and that's not what it's really about, right? Just a definition from a dictionary just says the state of being diverse or variety, right? Just variety, right? And so that just means that there's a difference. So, diversity is a property of groups, not individuals, right? Like I said, I am a Black woman in my field where there's less than 2% that are in this field as a whole, but really I'm not necessarily diverse. An individual cannot be diverse, but groups of individuals can possess diversity, right? So there are many differences that here. In this context, we more so focus on differences across social identity, like I talked about before, right? But every one of us, we possess multiple intersecting social identities, right? Like I said, the Venn diagram that's overlapping, right? So for some dimension of social difference, the scientific enterprise has a considerable degree of diversity. And in other ways, the scientific enterprise lacks diversity, especially when it comes to the participation of women, certain minority groups, and people with disabilities, right? But diversity in science really refers to cultivating talent and promoting the full inclusion of excellence across the entire social spectrum, right? So one, it's important because diversity is really critical to excellence in STEM, right? In Western cultures, our narratives about science often focus on the singular brilliant scientist who's made this substantial contribution based on their innate genius, right? We think of Albert Einstein or Isaac Newton or something like that, but scientific talent, it's not innate, right? It's cultivated through many hours of training, effort, and mentoring, right? More so, teams, not individuals, conduct most of scientific research. Thus, this narrative of this brilliant person that's going to rise to the top and such like that is like fails us in the modern research enterprise, right? So we need to focus on specific groups that have problem solving instead of like individual brilliance, right? And then a lack of diversity represents a loss of talent, really, as well too. Scientific advancement relies on this scientific talent, and scientific talent represents the end result of process of potential of being cultivated. That's why you now are starting to hear, oh, well, people can have access to these things, but if they're not supported while they're having access to them, then they're not going to be successful, whatever you're deeming of success to be. And then enhancing diversity is really key to long-term economic growth and global competitiveness. I mean, if we look around right now with what's going on in this very divisive political sphere that we're in, I don't know if any of you all have noticed, but we have less and less international students that are applying to go to the United States for school. And that's a problem. That's misconnection, that's miscollaboration, there's misfriendships, misrelationships. When I would travel to Africa and when the 2016 election landed the way that it did, that cupcake is broke, Poppy. Okay, baby. But when we I can't open it. Okay, why don't you go over there? Sorry. But I've often talked to research scientists that are older than me that are saying, I'm not sending my children to the United States to go to school anymore. And that's very troubling. That's extremely troubling. You know that the only people who are now going to go to school here are the people who can afford it, right? Not the people who really could benefit from it, but the people who are going to afford it. And there are other things too, that we're lacking in here too. The reason why people don't feel included and don't feel belonged is because this social belonging, people who are underrepresented, they have a hard time associating with STEM culture because of enrollment rate and representation of ethnically diverse groups. For me, I've never once had a professor who's of color at all. In my entire academic career, I've not once had one, right? And like I said, there's this notion that, well, we're trying, but the best talent isn't in the diverse groups. And that is a direct lie. That's because people don't want to go out and find it, because you're only going to the sources in which you regularly go to. And if you don't think that they're there, then they can't be anywhere. Right. And then there's disparities in affordability, right? It's just true. There is very little wealth that exists in underrepresented communities because we have been oppressed for such a long time in every single way you can possibly think of, like even going to home ownership as well too. So there is no equity in our communities. And so when people say that education pull you up, people don't go to college because they cannot afford it, right? Why would you want to graduate on $100,000 in debt when you're 22 years old, right? That's ridiculous. That is a hole in which you will never be able to get yourselves out of because of our inflation rates and the way in which things are. So some people simply remove themselves from their situation, not because they're motivated, just because they just cannot afford it, right? And then there's race gaps in our disciplines. If I don't see anybody that looks like me, it's very hard for me to attach it, that they can relate with what I was going through and such like that. When I was in school at OU, I worked at the couch cafeteria for 2 years, right? Because I got kicked out of my dorm room because I could not afford my tuition. I could not afford my room and board. I got locked out of my dorm room, right? My parents couldn't help me out at the time as well too. And so I had to take on a job, and the only place that would hire me like that was the couch cafeteria, right? So I didn't get to go to study groups or anything like that whatsoever. So I had to rely on people who are willing to get together with me after maybe everyone was already done with their homework or things like that. So in that way, it was very, very hard for me to relate to other people because nobody was working at the same time, right? Nobody was working part-time. Nobody smelled like food when they went to class and such like that too. None of this was anywhere in which I can bond with people on. And then when you take these difficult classes, And when you're reaching out for help and someone's saying to you, well, maybe this just isn't for you because you don't understand it, that's disheartening, right? That's making you feel as if, oh, maybe I do not have the intelligence to do this versus that person does. When this coursework is hard, it is so hard, right? It's not meant to be easy, right? But it is very difficult. And then there's testing as well too. We know that standardized testing does not spell out success, but people often say that it does, right? And so the reason why we need to start doing this is, like I said, because when you have a diverse group, right? Our STEM workforce consists of almost 9 million workers, right? Even fewer in meteorology as well too. There's a really good article that I think a lot of people know about Marshall Shepard, right? He used to be the president of AMS, like back in the day. He's one of like 3 Black men in the United States who has their PhD in meteorology as well too. But it's funny, he wrote an article about 2 years ago for Forbes magazine that says the myth that diversity takes my meteorology and related jobs from others, right? Meaning that if that person checks that they're Black or Hispanic, they're just getting that job because they're Black or Hispanic. And so he was trying to dispel that myth and saying, I've been working in meteorology since the 1990s. Most of the time when I go to anything, conferences, workshops, wherever, I'm the only one, right? His story is mine. And he started his career in the 1990s, and I started my career in 2007. And this is still the case in 2020 as well too, right? It is still the case years later that there is no representation. He has this anecdote in here that AMS in 2013, they did this survey of its members, right? So they sent out a survey to about 13 to 14,000 members and revealed only 2.1% of them were African American. Numbers were lower for Hispanic and Native Americans, so they just threw out the results for them because they were insignificant, right? They were just insignificant because they didn't even reach like 1%, right, of the population that was there, right? And so, and then there's a gap in educational attainment that's, separating us as well too, because we're less likely to graduate from high school, enroll in college, like I said, as well too. So, they just tossed them out, right? And there really has been no progress in diversity in the last 40 years, like to think about it being statistically significant as well too, right? 85% of doctoral degrees that are earned in the earth sciences were to people identifying themselves as non-Hispanic and white, according to that study as well too, right? So it really just goes back to the fact that there's just a lack of everything, right? And there's a lack of everything. And if it also is not coming from the top, if the people that are truly saying that they want diversity, if it's not coming from them, also, if we are not being included in that as well too, which is where this quote comes from, nothing about us without us. I'm really tired of being, this is just a term. I'm really tired of being white-splained to about what it is that I need to do, in order to, just wait, right? Well, maybe you should approach it this way, instead. Oppression is oppression. That's just it, right? There's no dealing with it anymore. That's bullshit, right? I don't need to deal with your oppression anymore, right? You need to stop oppressing, right? That's what this really is about. And so, having all of these, to be quite honest, having scholarships, having programs and such that are designed by the people who aren't part of the programs in which they should be helping is just ridiculous, right? And it's really got to stop, because there is talent out there. There are people out there who can lend their experiences and their talents and everything. And we need allies as well too. Not people who are, not people who are empathetic, but people who are sympathetic, right? I always tell people I would never want anyone to go through the experiences in which I've gone through. That's not great. Like, I never want anyone to do that. But I'm not also asking you for your stories of how you can relate to this, because you cannot, right? I don't want you to relate to this at all. I just want you to hear me out. And instead of saying there's no possibility that could have possibly happened, well, if it's coming out of my mouth, It happened, right? And I know that it sounds heinous sometimes and it sounds too terrible that it ever happened whatsoever, but it really did. And really, we are not very far from slavery. That was 1864, right? For slavery that has been happening since 1440, I think it's going to take more than 150 years for there to be some change in mindset, right? From everyone who was involved, right? So I just ask that as you all start thinking about this, like myself too, like I said, because I'm not an expert matter in this too, I have experiences, but there is still so much to learn. And when people are saying that they want to change things, that we all address our unconscious bias, we all address the privilege in which we have too, and we lend those to helping people. So you give up some of that privilege in order for there to be equity, right? You give up some of the things in which you've had before, which you know that you just have based on how what you were born into. That does not make you any more able than someone else, right? But if you can identify that that is something that's happening, that you hold yourself as accountable, right? And that you go forward like with a new understanding and understand that there's no saturation in this market yet for people who are underrepresented, right? And like I said, this is just my experiences as a Black individual, right? And as a female as well too, but I know that it lends itself to the LGBTQ IA plus community. I know it lends itself to females. I know it lends itself to people, to most people who are underrepresented and marginalized as well too. So we have to start thinking about that and how it's going to lend itself to only making things better, right? Like I said, I'm not a D&I expert. These are just like my opinions. I'd like to make that true again on the subject matter, but something that I feel very, very strongly about, right? I'm going to go ahead and go on. Like I was telling Amanda before, I'm like, my daughter is already getting restless. So I'm going to move forward and then I'll ask questions from you guys like afterwards. But something that I want to move on to now is what I call the importance of climate and weather information, right? This is symbolic of the environment that we live in and grew up in, and like probably patriarchy. But I did a TED talk about this a little while ago that I told nobody about, like as if I didn't think that it was important, or I didn't think that it was like some milestone in my career. I just was not trying to draw attention to myself like most people do, right? So, but I'll go into I was talking about the importance of climate and weather, and why it's so important that we think about this as open source data. So I have this picture right here because I think it's cool. I've always wanted to be a Marvel X-Men for a very long time. I've wanted to be a mutant. I'm not afraid to say it. I wish I were, so I could solve some of these problems with, controlling of the weather and climate right now. But she was able, Storm or Aurora Monroe, she was able to control the weather and the atmosphere. She's considered one of the most powerful mutants on the planet, right? She was the first major female character of African American descent in the Marvel universe. And she married the Black Panther, which nobody knows of because they got divorced, but it doesn't matter. But she still retained her title. Sorry. Now, I'm not really sure if my love for meteorology and climatology generated from like X-Men Storm, or my dad got me a book on meteorology when I was 8 years old, but still it stands, right? I'm heart everything that has to do with the coupled interactions between the atmosphere and the ocean, like the science, the natural events, the effects on society, and the data, right? It's all together amazing. It's wondrous. It's complicated. It's terrifying. I am not a storm chaser as well, too. I don't do that stuff, you guys. And because I clearly can't be Storm, right, I had to really get creative, which included getting a degree in meteorology. And I've done everything you can possibly think of. I've interned at the National Weather Center. I have given National Weather Center tours. I've run tests on weather radars. I've launched weather balloons. I've worked as a weather observer, like I said. I've created graphics, forecasting, routing ships. I even, like I said, so lightly dipped my toes in weather derivatives that kind of fizzled out. And then I took a break, right? And then I came back into the fold of climate services, where most of my work focuses on helping meteorological agencies, like I said, clean up their data for forecasting measures, and then taking this data, making it digestible via maps and graphs and trainings and workshops to the larger health and agricultural community to increase climate communication throughout the Horn of Africa, specifically in rural regions. And I participated in health conversations with Africa. But I want you guys to remember that term of climate services, But let's just back up a little bit because I like to be very clear. I'm not sure where everyone's understanding is. I don't like to assume, what we knew because I didn't know a lot like when I was a freshman or a sophomore for that matter when I was in meteorology. So when I talk about meteorology, I think you all know I'm speaking about weather processes and short-term forecasting, right? A timing between maybe now and 14 days in advance, give or take, because after that point, forecasts get a little wonky, a very scientific term, right? And they decrease in accuracy and skill, right? And mind you, we're still talking about predictions of chance that's based on patterns, none of which are 100% accurate. Nobody claimed they were. They're not supposed to be, right? And then macro and micro events that are happening all simultaneously with all sorts of potential and kinetic energy and everything that can change at a moment's notice, right? So we can blame the TV meteorologists all we want, but they're not magicians and they're certainly not storm, right? And then there's climatology, right? My favorite ology, right? It's defined as weather conditions average over a period of time. So seasonal, subseasonal, annual, decadal, same math, same physics, right? The same science. This is where we start talking about different things like natural climate variability and change. And I really like to make this distinction because they coexist and you really can't talk about one without the other, right? So this is my simplistic, like sixth grader approved analogy, right? So imagine you have a wave and you start randomly pulling out all the peaks and valleys so that it's wonky and uneven all around. And this represents natural climate variability. It would exist without climate change, right? We know this. And then climate variability capture timing and the severity of anomalies and extreme events, including tropical cyclones and hurricanes and floods and droughts and waves and severe storms, wildfires, et cetera, right? And then the uber cool teleconnections such as El Nino. And then take that distorted wave, right, and stretch it out on the left side and scrunch it up on the right side, pull out the peaks and valleys even further on the right-hand side, and then tilt the whole wave pattern upwards, right? That's climate change. That's the extreme meteorological and climatological events that become more extreme and more frequent over the time. And like I said, you're probably saying, duh, I totally already know what this is, right? But I want to bring you into the world of applied climatology, right? And more specifically, climatology and its effects on society and the role in this decision making, which is my jam, right? So when I explain to people that I was once a meteorologist who now works in applied climatology, do I expect people to understand what this means? No. Do I love being asked repeatedly if I'm on TV? Nope. Do I summon all my inner storm powers and create all these lightning bolts and tornadoes and straight line winds and such in my head when people tell me that I'm pretty enough to be on TV? Yes. That really bothers me as well too. But why don't people understand that meteorologists and climatologists can work not only in media, but also within academia and research and private and government industries and finance and NGOs, right? I don't know if you guys ever watched that. I don't know if you guys ever watched Trading Places. Has anybody heard of that movie? With Eddie Murphy and Dan Aykroyd. It's about where they trade places and then they expose the Mortimer brothers for insider trading because they're shorting the price of oranges, right? That's based on false weather forecasts and reports, right? So the correct forecast clearly came from meteorologists and climatologists, right? So even though this is fictitious, this encapsulates the power of weather and climate forecasts and how influential and disruptive they can be. So weather and climate data are the inputs that we need to run these models, to run these forecasts, and typically 30 years worth of quality control data is what's needed to generate these skilled and accurate forecast predictions and climate change projections, right? So when I talk about climate service, a service is something that meets a need or fulfills a demand, right? And this is the jam that I was talking about earlier, I was alluding to about applied climatology, right? It's a strange situation because there are so many of us that are managing services, but few of us can succinctly articulate what a service is, right? In fact, without jumping ahead of myself, the answer to the question is not easy, but it's just a service that also has value, outcomes, costs, and risk. So what climate services is it involves the production, the translation, the transfer, and the use of climate knowledge and information in a climate-informed decision-making and climate-smart policy and planning, right? Those who work in climate services, we strive to ensure that there's the best available climate science and that it's effectively communicated with all sectors that are involved, agriculture, water, health, energy, to develop and evaluate adaptation strategies, right? And then this climate knowledge and info, especially the data, also needs to be accessible, timely, and relevant to help societies in current climate variability and change and limit the economic and social damage that's caused by climate-related disasters. But these effective climate services require established technical capacities and co-production mechanisms, right? Producers and user communities. So even though the concept and the term climate services it's not new by any means whatsoever, and at times I find that it's less known in the developed world more than the developing world, right? But it is a crucial building block of climate services is the accessibility, availability, and the use of climate data. And here in the United States, we don't think twice about where we obtain our weather and climate data and forecasts because for the most part, it's free and accessible to the public. So how do climate services work? Right, so there's data that's collected and it's transformed and it's customized into products such as projections, trends, economic analysis, and services. It also includes national and international databases that provide this high quality data, usually on temperature and rainfall, wind, soil moisture, ocean conditions, as well as these maps, this risk and vulnerability analysis and assessments. And then there's socioeconomic variables and non-meteorological data like agricultural production or health trends, human settlements, and high-risk areas. And then the different ways in which we deliver these climate services are directly accessible climate products, such as like rainfall intensity or frequency, duration data and maps, maybe targeted climate products that are delivered through appropriate media like cell phones, or published climate data statistics, or directly accessible climate data, right? And here in the United States, we're supported by, right, the National Weather Service under the umbrella of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. We have over 122 local weather forecast stations. We have over 1,000 volunteers. So if need be, anyone can freely and without consequence utilize this climate data, like access this climate data and apply this information in different ways. But this hasn't been without attempts to commercialize and dismantle US free domains. You know, every like election cycle, they vote on whether to commercialize our weather data from the National Weather Service and from the NOAA, and it gets turned down every single time, but there are still lobbyists who want to charge money for us, for the public to use weather data. And I preface with the status of the US climate data, regardless of the failed attempts to commercialize weather and climate data, because we're lucky and we understand the return on investment for free weather and climate data because it's been established and it's precedented. This is a completely different story for meteorological agencies of African countries, in which my colleagues and I have collaborated with for decades. You know, as researchers and scientists, we know that better climate predictions require meteorological agencies to open and expand and improve their data archives, but oftentimes commercial concerns and a lack of trust are holding them back. Right? So the first thing that I want to get to is lack of availability. So this first graphic is of Rwanda, and can anybody note what that dip in is? And these are the average number of reporting weather stations in Rwanda. If you notice the dip in 1994, that was directly from the genocide, right? They just stopped. There was just there's no weather data that was collected, which means that they are always deficient, right? And that they are really trying to play catch up to have really sound weather forecasts and predictions, because it's just a lack of things that are there. There's also a lack of investment in climate infrastructure has been a major impediment of climate data collection for many, many, many years. No, stop, please. And then there's, like I said, there's also been conflict and political upheaval. Like I said, these gaps in observations are problematic because when you're attempting to analyze past patterns and project long-term trends, you just don't have it there. And then there's limited technical capacity and inadequate data sharing policies. Sorry. And then inadequate data sharing policies within the National Meteorological Agency. It makes it really difficult. You know, a lot of the times you have to request the data from them. They may charge you or not. And then if you're trying to point out any errors in their data whatsoever, you're then going against the government, right? And you could be tried for that. Like in Tanzania, if you use weather data and they're not they're not on board with what you're using it for and you use it illegally, you can be jailed for up to 3 years. Right? There are things like this that are going on everywhere. Free and accessible climate data is something that happens in the United States and certain parts of Europe and Canada, but in many other places, it doesn't exist. So what you do is you combine reanalysis data and you combine weather observation data and you blend it and you make the second and third dairy products. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But there's also a lack of access, right? That means you cannot access the data because it's due to geography. That's due to geography. So we know that ground weather stations are the most true source of data because they are raw observations. No more. No, here. You see, I just have to bribe my daughter with technology. It's really quite sad. Sorry. So currently the primary source of climate data are these ground-based weather observation stations. They give the truest measurements of climate variables of interest. However, in many parts of Africa, the stations are sparse, they're declining in number, and they're unevenly distributed, right? You can tell like this area that's over the Sahara and the Congo is difficult geography and terrain. So it's just no weather observations that are being taken there. The mountains, the forests, the deserts, they make the installation and maintenance difficult. They limit the number of observation stations that are outside, cities and towns. And as a result, coverage tends to be the worst in really rural areas. And this is exactly where livelihoods may be the most vulnerable to climate variability and climate change, right? I have been to places where there are stacks and stacks and stacks of notebooks, right, that are towering loose pieces of paper of carefully recorded weather and climate observations that go back decades, right? And to me, these records are really similar to when you're answering competency-based questions in an interview, right? Because they're backing up like the reason why you're even doing anything in the first place, right? They're designed to test how past behavior will predict future behavior on the job, right? That's what behavioral questions are for. That's what this data is for too, right? It's used to predict future behavior, right? And then the third thing that's done is the use, right? The lack of use, right? You can't use it if you don't know it's there, right? So it doesn't matter if people put it out too, but if they put it out and it's not digestible, or it's not in a way, or if it's not in the language, or if it's like discounting indigenous knowledge as well too, oftentimes I'm talking about Westerners, we'll go in with all of our knowledge to another country, we'll come up with all these great ideas without involving anyone, right, who are directly using it, and then we'll drop it, like dropping the mic there, and then we'll slowly back up and say, look how great this is, and then our funding runs out to do the projects, and then we just leave, and we leave this completely unusable tool, that was not co-produced or anything like that, right, and does not take into the needs of other people, so then they can't use it. Right? And I talked about digitization before. Like, it's a solution that's also presented to capture these millions of records across the continent, but agencies lack trained and dedicated staff members. They have high turnaround too, and their pay is crap, and they work there for decades and decades and decades on end, so they lock out younger generations from working as well too. But unlike the US, like many of these national meteorological agencies, they have commercial mandates for their government. They sit at the very low end of the totem pole for how the government funds them. I've been to meteorological agencies where their bathrooms don't work. You have to bring your own toilet tissue. They're still charting out scutees by hand, right? They're still like drawing all of the isotherms and the isobars around all of like the weather maps and such that they have too. So they're mandated with raising money themselves. So the only way for them to raise money sometimes is to charge for their weather data, right? And so there's really complex histories about why things don't exist, because it's very easy to go inside of another country and say, how are we supposed to do any of this research with you guys? We don't have the weather data, without you even understanding, that they have to raise their own money and fund themselves, because we don't have to here, right? We don't have to at all. Yeah, they have to generate their own revenue. So to them, giving researchers and students free and unrestricted access to data is preventing them from commercializing their data and preventing them from making money. All right. And there's also this matter of trust. Like, given that agencies are the custodians of their climate data, they also feel very responsible for the misrepresentation, the misinterpretation, and the exploitation of their data. And why wouldn't they? Africa's been exploited from like the 1400s as well too. So when we think about these things and we think about, well, why isn't it like that, there is a very, very strong history there of things being stolen and people not being able to have a return on investment like we see here. But what about the gaps in all of these things, right? So I talked about these three things like availability, accessibility, and use, right? There are novel efforts that have been done to improve the availability of climate data and information products in Africa, right? In particular, what I worked on for my 5 years in which I was at the Research Institute for Climate and Society is something that's called ENACS, or the Enhancing National Climate Services, led by my colleagues at Columbia University and the IRI. And ENACS focuses on the creation of making reliable and downscaled climate information that's suitable for all levels of decision making. So through ENACS, data availability is improved because we would merge and blend the best available and quality control data of the meteorological agency with global available data products, like free and global available data products. So I'm talking about, like, so when I talked about reanalysis data and when I talk about satellite data, right? And then accessibility is improved by offering free online tools for data analysis, of visualization, and then encourage engagement by stakeholders. So a lot of the times what I would do is create what's called map rooms, or use map rooms that were there, and then I would go to a different country and show them how they could manipulate the map rooms and go, downscaled, and how they could just visualize the seasonality of temperature and rainfall in their district. So they could go around and they could make seasonal maps, like based on how things have changed now, right? In variability of temperature and rainfall, because that's what they use most for seasonal planning. So for instance, like, if there's going to be a hunger season, and because of a hunger season, people are going to hoard more food, and because they hoard more food, they're going to be eating more starchy foods, which means they're going to be malnourished now because they're not eating leafy greens and they're not eating everything else that's going to decrease their micronutrients, and then because of that, they're more susceptible to infectious disease, right? And so everything like plays a role in all of this, and being able to note based on past events, and then based on some teleconnections too, we can very much like forecast INSO, right? That's one of the teleconnections in which we have down packed. Some of the other ones are definitely less, definitely, we're still doing a lot of research and stuff around. But if INSO has made a dry season, for your village, like in the past, and an El Nino is a forecast, or a La Nina event is forecast, or maybe a neutral event is forecast, and what it has done in the past, then you could predict what it might do in the future. So you can either ramp down or ramp down programming and funding around that's based on those things. And so those are the things that I would go into the health community and the agriculture communities and teach them a lot about, but on things in which they can digest, right? As we talked about earlier, meteorology and climatology is extremely complex, right? It's a complex science, right? But a lot of people know what's going on, right? And where they've lived for the longest amount of time. But if we can back it up with science and back it up with something that they can visualize as well too, it goes that much further in planning processes, right? It's not the raw data itself, but it's enhanced data sets and these byproducts. And then use is increased as well too, because we're doing trainings and we're raising user awareness about these enhanced data sets and a broad spectrum of actors that are able to come in and incorporate this climate information into their decision-making processes. That's improving both climate and development outcomes as a general, right? In general. So most of the times what we're doing is we're increasing use, and by increasing use, we're increasing demand, right? Because if you are demanding your meteorology to have your meteorological agencies to have quality controlled data, and then they don't, the meteorological agency can then go to the government and say, our people need this, otherwise we're going to have private industries that come in and do it for us, right? So if the people can support, the sovereign the sovereign agencies that are there, right, and demand that from them, then usually that has a better effect on getting funding from the government. It's very complicated, and I definitely like made it sound less complex than it really is. But that's a lot of the work in which I did for a very, very long period of time. Still work to be done because there's a whole climate service industry that's exploding, right, too. But it won't be sustainable if there are still data restrictive policies all over the world from meteorological agencies because their governments are not supporting the meteorological agencies. Thus, the decision making powers of the people who need that information the most is lacking, right? So that's what I wanted to talk about. Some of the research work in which I still do as well too, and which I'll continue to do as long as I'm able to. And like I said, most of it did affect the health community as a whole. So, oh, cool! It's right at 7 as well too. So I just wanted to know if anybody had any questions or concerns or things that they wanted to bring up. I know that was a lot. It was a lot of information in an hour, and I thank you for bearing with me. But does anyone have any questions that they have for me or anything that they want to challenge me on, or they want to they want to note or anything?
Feel free to come off mute if you guys want to ask any questions or type in the chat.
Is there contact information in case we think of questions after that we could potentially put back up on the screen if possible?
You mean, can you contact me later?
Yes, if we have questions that we think
Oh
of.
yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Amanda has my email address. You can just email
Okay.
me.
Yeah. I can send it out if you want.
Yeah. You must be in the classroom.
Yeah, we're in the public forecasting office right now because
Okay.
our little student thing starts in a bit, but
Sure.
I'm digesting all your information, so I want to come up
Yeah,
with it later.
I know it's a lot. That's not even like 20% of the work in which I do. I just wanted to truncate it. And it's a very interesting amount of work to get into. I mean, I have to say, when I was a student, I had no idea like about fields that existed like this. I started off in the RAU program. That's how long I've known Daphne Zaris, guys. I started off in the RAU program in 2005. I was one of the youngest admins that was there. Daphne is still my mentor to this date. And so my project while I was there, I was studying meteorology, of course, and I was studying Spanish as well too. And so I was studying like weather awareness in the Hispanic community and went out into Oklahoma City. So I've always had, and I think that many of you do have this desire to, the interface of meteorology, climatology, any earth sciences, and how it's affecting society. And that's absolutely what we need. Absolutely, we need scientists that are always going to do the research, but there is a great need for communicators and people who can relay this information, and that it also can take an indigenous knowledge and understand what other people need, really hear them out, right? And that's why I say diversity is really important too, because if you're always creating without including the people in which you're claiming to help, then it will always fall flat. It will always be ineffective, right? And weather and climate outputs, definitely, like I said, they affect the people who are underrepresented the most, and their voices are left out of everything, of absolutely everything. And so if we can get in the mindset of that, we always have to be working in society. We cannot hold ourselves up, do research on our own, even just collaborate with the people in which we know best, right? If you are in the community in which you're in, I tell this to everybody, especially if you go to grad school outside of where you're norm, or if Norman is new for you, do you all know like how the weather and the climate are affecting the communities the most? Has anyone gone out into the communities? Have you asked them, what it is that they need as you're a student? Because you're going to be working on solutions, moving forward. Has anybody gone into, communities that are affected the most, right, and ask them about what they need, volunteered in those communities as well too? Everyone always says boomer sooner and how much they love Nopton and such like that, but not really understanding like the community in which you live in. So I definitely encourage you guys to do that as well too. And that's something that I do in every new city that I live in. I seek out what the environmental justice like group is that's there, so I can understand. nor. So I can understand. I knew for a long time how climate and health affect, the effects of climate and health at an international stage, but I was starting to understand that I had no idea who it was affecting my local community, right? And so I definitely encourage all of you all, if you ever get a chance when we reach some new normal, from this, that you start like understanding and going to your communities and seeing how you can use the education in which you are so fortunate to have to really like influence some change. You're too loud. Okay.
I have kind of a quick question. Going back to like graduating in recession and things like that, do you have like any tips for like seniors and maybe also juniors right now about how to kind of like feel knowing that we might be graduating into,
Mm-hmm.
like
Yeah, no, knowing that you might be graduating. I'm, I understand, and I always tell people take this with a grain of salt, right? When I work with my students, right, you should start learning how to pitch yourselves, like understanding what are your intentions to do with your degree, right? Because we are creating a lot of jobs, right? They're not jobs that are just popping up. It's not like I said, it's not like the finance sector where there are just all these jobs because people are making money and such like that, right? There's a very limited amount of jobs, especially for people who want to be just pure forecasters. There's only so many jobs in the National Weather Service, guys, right? And so that's not going to be a possibility for everywhere. And there are only so many jobs, period. So one, being open to moving, as crappy as that sounds sometimes, like really being open to relocating, really understanding how to pitch yourself and sell your why, and getting very comfortable, and then acknowledging what your inherent skills are. Like, it's just an exercise in which everybody should be doing. What are you naturally gifted at, right? How can you apply that in the field of meteorology, right? Not everyone is like, just because your friend is doing this one thing doesn't mean you have to do it. You don't have to be, super duper gifted in math or physics, right? Those are the baseline for what you need to know for everything else, right? It's like when I got into my weather observer job for at an airport and such like that. I'm not using any thermodynamics class since I've graduated or anything like that, right? But they set the basis for me understanding what LCL was when I needed to look up in the sky and estimate like where, the base cloud levels were and in what part of the atmosphere in which they were in, right? And just being open to jobs like that, right? There's so much to learn, in these entry level jobs all across the board, right? If it's in weather communications, like take a shot, like just take a shot in doing anything like whatsoever, because you're going to gain some experience and it's going to be transferable experience. It's okay to be scared of working. It's a scary thing to do, to pay for your own shit yourself. Like, it's a scary thing. Nobody wants to do that, right? But yeah, nobody wants to do that. Nobody wants to pay for bills and such like that. But it's just a thing, and always remembering to keep your mental health first and foremost, like to really like invest in yourself outside of your career as well, to understand you're going to have some pivots in your career, right? I've left this field and come back to it 2 times, right? And that's okay, right? That is absolutely okay. And now, like, I find myself, now that there's an interdisciplinary spin, like there's just so much to think about. I mentored one student who was really he had a keen interest for selling tennis shoes, like, buying tennis shoes, like, whether they were Yeezys or Dwayne Wade's or something like that, right? Would buy up all the tennis shoes and stuff like that and sell them at a higher price. And he's a meteorology student, but he wasn't doing really well in his classes because there was no connectivity to it. But, his shipping and how fast they get to his client directly has to do with the weather and UPS, and how UPS uses weather forecasts and USPS and things like that. And it was only with that it finally clicked. It's not like this was a straight A student or anything like that, but it made that information that much more digestible to him because somebody was able to meet him where he was at. Someone was able to say, these experiences in your life are valid, right? They valid and they count. And just because like you didn't come from this background doesn't mean that you're not capable of moving, successfully around in this career. So I would say to people, like, think about like the things in which you like to do and how you can relate them to what you're doing in your major. It makes it that much easier to get through these difficult courses and see the silver lining at the end as well too, and also start looking for jobs now. Like, I definitely think that you should start looking now. You should never wait, right? Like, I love to procrastinate just like the next person and such like that, but you should start looking now so that you understand what's out there and you can prepare yourself for it.
I actually thought of a question, so I don't have to email you later.
No, it's okay.
You talked about getting involved and getting active in your community and reaching out. Um, what are the best avenues that you've found in order to do that? Because it can be hard in certain cities and certain areas to find out those climate active and environmental active organizations and where they are.
Sure. So I'm not even just talking about, to be quite honest, I'm not just talking about like the organizations that exist in your communities that are like, climate concerned or weather concerned too. I'm just sometimes talking about communities in general. Just volunteering at a school, right? Because just by your being there is a way in which you're going to be able to bring someone into the knowledge in which and see if you can communicate it in a digestible manner. It's always great to try it out on kids because kids will definitely tell you what you said doesn't make sense, right? It doesn't make sense at all. Like, think about you're explaining some of the information in which you've learned to a really bright 10-year-old, right? If that 10-year-old is confused after you've said something to them, that means that it just doesn't make sense, right? And it's just actually like getting out there. Like, I understand what you're talking about. There are some communities that will not have organizations like this. Like, they just won't, right? But actually understanding like the community in which you live in, the demographics of the demographics of Norman, like the different sides, how they're affected differently, because we know, that when severe weather moves through Norman, like the west side of Norman will be different than the north side of Norman, than the south side of Norman, et cetera, right? And there are different communities that live in those different areas of Norman as well too, that are sometimes based on race, that are sometimes based on ethnicity, that are sometimes based on religion, that, I would be hard pressed to find any students that really know, like, really about it and like the history of Norman itself too, or the greater Oklahoma City area. So, like, there's different outlets to do it, and I hear this all the time, that it can just feel very overwhelming and intimidating, especially if you're not part of the communities in which I'm talking about you're going out to. And someone told me this. Oh, well, I'll just say who it is because Jens doesn't care, but Jens once told me, like, when we were talking about the Black Lives Matter movement, and he was like, I was really reticent to reach out to you. He was like, because, like, I don't want you to inundate you with questions and such like that, and make you feel like you're the subject matter on this, and I have no one else to turn to because you must be getting all of these questions from other people. And I was like, Jens, you're talking about celebrities. I was like, that is not my experience. I was like, my experience is not being completely overwhelmed, by other people asking me questions. In fact, nobody asked me anything at all. I was like, nobody includes me in any of their conversations at all. I was like, and you got your tip from Twitter. I was like, so, go out and actually talk to people instead of just reading. Like, so we have a tendency to just read things and be like, okay, well, I'm not going to do it because, this is going to make them uncomfortable. It's going to make me uncomfortable. I'm just not going to do it whatsoever. But that's the reason why we're in this whole predicament in the first place, is because we're not talking to one another, because we're so afraid to cause offense, right? Or we're so afraid to say the wrong things. Say the wrong things once, apologize it, and move forward and learn, right? That's the quickest way to get around that and to show that you're human. Does anybody else have any other questions? I usually see more of you guys, because, because I'm able to travel more, just like everybody else was. But I've not been on campus in a while, just like a lot of you have been. So, I definitely look forward to in the future, because I sit on the board of advisors too for the College of AGS, and I'm usually there for some fundraising events and some other events like Weatherfest and things like that. I haven't been so much because you hear the little one that's here. She's commandeering, time and conversations and sounding cute and stuff. So, but I do look forward to, and I really encourage you guys, if you want to reach out, or anything, and talk about anything that has to do with it. Because, like I said, I have dual roles and I really enjoy them both. I really enjoy working at the precipice of climate and society, but I also really enjoy, career services because I'm still excited about my future. I'm excited about you all's future as well too. We need people to not be so jaded because this is some jady kind of stuff, like to be involved in to be involved in working in this, and just wait until you start working, like you start interfacing with politicians and stuff like that. It can feel excruciatingly painful and such too, but we need people to be engaged in this work, and to be excited about it and hopeful about this as well too. No one would be in the earth sciences if we weren't hopeful, about what could be and the changes that could be made. So if you're ever feeling like a little down and such like that, and you want someone to, complain to and things like that, do not reach out to me. If you want someone to light a fire under your ass, please reach out to me.
Does anyone have any final questions? Going once, going twice. Again, I would like to thank you so much for coming out and spending time and talking with us.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for asking me. It is truly a pleasure now. I keep on forgetting that I've been working for a little bit, and when people reach out to me, I'm like, why? Like I was just because it just, time just flies by. And so sometimes I forget, sometimes I forget for sure. But I do really appreciate it. I do wish all of you all the best of luck. I know that things are difficult right now, and I'm not trying to take away from the fact that you have, you can feel everything, and all of your feelings are valid, all of your anxiousness, and just fear for not just like politically what's going on in the country, but health wise as well too. It's a lot, but I'm not gonna say I'm not gonna say like simple comments like we're gonna get through this and things like that. It's all gonna be okay, because I don't know, right? But I do know that the work in which you're engaging in, the education in which you're engaging in too, is going to be very, very helpful. So I hope that everyone is staying safe and healthy as best as you can. And I look forward to talking to any of you all if you want anytime soon.
Thank you so much. You have so many thank yous in the chat. I don't know.
Oh, I'm not even looking in the chat. Thanks, guys. All right. Well, you guys have a good rest of your meeting. Thank you for letting me go earlier, Amanda. I'm going to try to put my daughter to bed and try to like finish up some other work. But you guys, best of luck, and I'll speak to some of you later.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Bye-bye. You too.
For everyone else